Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nick Coombs from Sonotype. I have responsibility for our international business in EMEA. So thanks for choosing this room over the other room, I suppose. You know, our software developers, the latest front in mitigating risk inside our applications. And, you know, do you know what vulnerable components or libraries sit inside your applications? To most people, the answer is no, they don't. But I'd like to spend a little bit of time just talking about the problem, about the ecosystem, and how we can help you mitigate some of these issues. I think we've seen recently a real step change with the regulators. Up until the start of the year, we had the Information Commissioner's Office issue the two largest fines they've ever issued were £400,000. One was to TalkTalk, and one was to Carphone Warehouse. And I think a lot of organizations look at fines as being, do we want to take it as a business risk? You know, we're trying to push our applications into our data centers to go live quicker and quicker and quicker. So lots of organizations, you know, before the start of the year, perhaps were taking the fines as maybe it's a business risk. It's changed. You know, in recent months, we saw BA got fined a potential £183 million for losing 380,000 records. Actually, interesting enough, one of the records was my record. And I get the email from BA in the morning saying, congratulations, yeah, we've lost your credentials. And that was an interesting hack, and it's something we've seen many, many times before and after that. Something called Magecart. It's really interesting. It's a customized attack that's been focused in the predominantly the JavaScript community. We've also seen Marriott. They were fined £99 million, or potential fine £99 million by the ICO recently as well. So I think we've seen a step change in these fines. You know, for BA, and yeah, it was just 22 lines of custom JavaScript code that was appended to an open source library called Modernizer. £183 million is a lot of profit to make out of a lot of airline seats. We've seen the UK government now talking about manager software dependencies. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's something that the government now is trying to urge organizations who are building their own software to do something about it. And we've all heard about Equifax. Equifax was a massive breach in September 2017. About 12 months ago, they put into their financial report that it cost them $400 million to date to fix that problem. They just got fined another $700 million. So that's over $1 billion. So today's exchange rates, that's £1 billion. You know, it's sort of something that no one would have thought that a little open source library would cost so much because it's free. What we find is if you're developing in those modern application languages, such as Java or JavaScript or Python or the .NET ecosystem or some of those newer languages such as Go, which is really, you know, coming along huge strides in popularity. What we find, people have stopped writing code from scratch anymore. You know, it's not like what used to happen 25, 30 years ago when, you know, we were writing in C or COBOL or RPG or whatever. We now reuse as much as we can. Gone are those waterfall days when we had 18 months to actually push an application into production that no one wanted, you know, that time. Yeah, we're trying to release faster and faster and faster. So what we find, 80 to 90% of a modern application is made up of predefined components, and most of that is open source. And if we look at the open source ecosystems, this is just a snapshot. So NPM is server-side JavaScript. There's over 5.5 million unique libraries there. Java, there's over 3.5 million unique libraries. And obviously the other ecosystems are, you know, are still in those millions of unique libraries. So there's lots of choice for the developer, lots of functionality they can reuse. And if we look at, you know, how much the developers are using this, this is the downloads from Maven Central, which is the central Java open source public repository at maven.org. There were 146 billion downloads last year. NPM, so server-side JavaScript, 7 billion a week. And that's 350 billion a year. So not only are there lots and lots of open source libraries that developers can use, they're using them dramatically as well. And one of the reasons, this is a dummy application, but it gets complex very, very quickly. So this is an application. As a developer, I might say I want to use 4 open source libraries. But, you know, they bring in their friends and their friends of their friends because, strangely enough, open source libraries rely on other open source libraries to provide that functionality. It's a bit like that teenage Facebook party. You know, parents go away for the weekend, your son or daughter invites 5 friends, and then 500 people turn up to, you know, whatever with your house. That's a dummy application. I only defined 4 things, but here's something a little bit more real. You know, I might define the top layer, but it brings in all this other layer. So what we found is a typical Java application has 127 open source libraries. The .NET ecosystem, a lot smaller, maybe 30, 40 open source libraries because it's been closed source for many, many years. We move into the JavaScript world and it gets into thousands really, really quickly. We did a POC recently. We analyzed an application. This is a FTSE company. They had 12,000 JavaScript files in their main application. You know, how do you work out what's good, what's bad? It's really, really hard thing to do. The top 3,500 organizations in the world, on average, downloaded 170,000 Java libraries. In that JavaScript world, you know, a typical developer might download 60,000. So the ecosystem is very complex. It's very, very huge. There's lots of choice for the developer. But obviously, developers have very strict governance that they follow every day to make sure that their applications are safe and have the quality, you know, required for production. Of course they do. You know, not all parts are created equal. Most open source is fantastic. It is there to allow us to build these really, really functionally rich applications. But not all open source is equal. You know, we've seen, you know, this move to this component-based development. You know, we're not going to change, you know, the way we build software. We're not going to go back to writing software from scratch and having delivery cycles that are months or years. You know, we're speeding up. You know, to lots of organizations, 2 weeks for a release is too slow. They want to do multiple releases a day. And open source doesn't age like wine. It ages like milk. It goes bad over time. Applications, yeah, we've seen, this is a survey from last year, you know, over half of the organizations that we surveyed said that they'd had at least one breach. At least one breach. So it's not something that's specific to a small amount of very targeted organizations. It's pretty generic. And why is this? 10.3% of the downloads from the Java public repository had known security vulnerabilities. That's about 15 billion of those downloads. Actually, if an average application's got 127 libraries, that's probably 13 of those libraries are vulnerable. But that's statistics. In the JavaScript world, this is some data from Larry Voss, who was CDO and CTO at NPM. They analyzed 3.4 million JavaScript applications. They found 51% of them had vulnerabilities. So I just want to be as fair as possible to all the various different ecosystems, not pick on one. You know, developers know. 48% is an interesting statistic, actually, when it comes to the UK. But yeah, 48% developers know it's important, but they just don't have time to spend on it because their focus is getting that release out. I've got to get it out in my 2-week sprint, my 1-week sprint, or my very, very short release cycle. You know, and that's what I focus on as a developer. And one of the reasons is, you know, typical organization might have 100 developers. There'll be 10 operations people to, you know, feed, water, power, manage, you know, 10 people in operations, but there's one security person on average. In fact, we had a lady from Salesforce present to us earlier in the year, and Salesforce is an enormous company. They have one security person as well. So, you know, some of these numbers, that's the reason why we're seeing applications that have vulnerabilities. There's not enough security people to help those developers make those right, informed choices as part of their process. Organizations don't have meaningful controls. You know, 62% don't have meaningful controls. It means that as developers are choosing anything from this ecosystem, it's just going into production. And that's something I think as a security community is something we don't really want to happen. So just picking up on some of these breaches, because some of them are really interesting. So Equifax, which has turned out to be, to date, the biggest breach from a cost perspective to date. They used an open source library called struts2-core. Went vulnerable in March. The Struts project is a brilliant project. If someone finds a vulnerability, they will fix the vulnerability and announce the fix and the disclosure at the same time. So there's always a good version of Struts. In fact, there's two branches, so there's always two good versions. They had a vulnerability in the March. Equifax were using this in one of their key applications. They discovered the breach in July. They disclosed to the market in the September. They lost 143 million records. So, and I'm sure, actually I was speaking to someone earlier today, their records were lost. Now, predominantly most of that was in the US, but certainly that hit us in the UK today. But what happened next was the really interesting thing. A couple of weeks after that disclosure, the CIO, the CISO, the CEO all left the company. In fact, the CIO is now in prison. Unfortunately, he decided to trade his stock options in that July to September window. So basically, insider trading. So he's gone to jail for that. So roll forward to 12 months from that original disclosure. The pink line there is the downloads of that vulnerable version of that open source library on the public repository. In the March, 100,000 downloads. In the April, 80,000. So it goes down. Sort of makes sense because it's a high-profile project. Lots of developers will stop using it. But I'd expect that line to go straight down to zero pretty much over a few months. But as we roll forward, nothing's changed. Developers are still downloading this library in earnest, even though this has become the library that gave us the biggest breach, a huge press attention, high-profile project. And it's true in JavaScript. Handlebars is a popular framework in JavaScript. 87% of those libraries have vulnerabilities. Commons Collection, which we saw the year before, in 2016, and this is, if people are using Java in their ecosystems, this is probably in one of two Java applications. So this is a pretty major library, very old library, been around for a long, long time. It went vulnerable. Out of those 23 million downloads that year, 78% of them were vulnerable. Spring, which is the other project, so not to pick on Struts as a bad project, the other framework in Java is Spring. And again, it has vulnerabilities. And again, the developers downloading it, it just doesn't change. They carry on using it. And I personally believe that developers don't want to do bad things. They don't. They're not bad people. They're creative people. But the problem is it's really hard to find out information about these open source libraries. And wouldn't it be lovely if you knew what was in your applications, that if you knew what versions of those libraries that you had, which versions were vulnerable, which ones were the clean versions, so your developers could use those versions, the clean versions, at the start of the process. Can you imagine, rather than actually going to some esoteric architectural system, that the developer could just use their IDE, just in the environment that they used to run in, just see what's good, what's bad, and how to actually choose the good one at the start of the process. But as security professionals, we need not only to trust the development organization, but to verify that as well. So we need to have a bill of materials for our applications, to know what's inside our applications, what open source libraries are included, and are they good or bad? Because we've got to know the risk at the end of the day. And hopefully, most applications don't have the risk, but we really need to know what the risk is. And we've also got to reduce the noise. One of the problems with tools and technologies, and certainly in that application security testing environment, is it's very, very noisy. Lots of false positives. So we've got to make sure that we minimize that to as near zero as possible. And false negatives, we just can't have false negatives. We can't have organizations putting applications into production thinking they're safe when really they've got some quite serious vulnerabilities in it. But if you look at the disclosures, disclosures of vulnerabilities are always done by security people, and they're very, very terse. And it's purposely terse, because you don't want that bad actor, that hacking community, to understand how to breach something. Classic of that is Xerces, which is a popular open source library. If you look at the CVE on the National Vulnerability Database, it says if you're using IBM JRE version 5.1.6 through 5. Blah, 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 you're vulnerable. To most developers, even if they managed to get there in the first place, which they probably wouldn't, but if they saw that, they would just ignore it. I'm not using the IBM JRE, so I'm not vulnerable. What IBM were trying to do was to get you onto the next version of the JRE, because that version of the JRE included a vulnerable open source library. But they just wanted you to get onto the next version, because most of those disclosures are done at the application layer, not the open source layer. So we need to provide to the developer information in developer speak. Information so the developer can understand what the vulnerability is. Because it's only the developer that can fix these vulnerabilities. So discover if you have the problem. So who are Sonatype? So we've been at the heart of the open source movement for many, many, many years. Our founders, Jason Van Zyl and Brian Fox. Brian's our CTO today. Jason invented Maven. And Maven became that build and dependency management tool of choice, certainly in that Java ecosystem. And it really started that open source library sharing movement around Java as a programming language. Now, obviously, people wanted to start sharing these libraries, so we built Maven Central, which is that central public repository that we still run on behalf of the open source community. 3.5 million libraries, 146 billion downloads, 10.3% of those being vulnerable. Now, because we ran that central repository, we started to sort of see these anti-patterns, whereby things would go vulnerable and people would carry on using them, which doesn't make sense, because you'd expect people, if they saw something go vulnerable, they'd stop using it. So that led us to deliver tools and technologies and a solution that helps you mitigate the risk from those open source libraries that you're including in your modern programming languages. So what our technology and what our solution does is we have a firewall capability. And what that capability does is if your developers or your build tools are trying to download from those public repositories open source libraries with known vulnerabilities, we'll block them. We all lock our doors at night. Doesn't matter where we live, we all lock our doors at night. Stop those bad things coming in. That's what we do. Why would you ever want an open source library that has a CVSS 10 ever coming into the organization? You just wouldn't. Why would you want an open source library maybe with an AGPL license ever coming in, or something that's 15 years old ever coming in? You want to try and block the bad things, and you can define what the policy is. Oh dear, the colonel's here, so I've got to speed up. He gets upset if I'm late. So once those libraries have been ingested, we then integrate with all the development tooling. So the developer in Eclipse or IntelliJ or Visual Studio can see what they're using, what the vulnerabilities. We help them to choose the right libraries at the start of the process. Integrate with the build environment. So scan the application that's been built, that application that's on its way to that release cycle, just to check if it's got any vulnerabilities. And if it does, break the build. Again, why would you want a vulnerable application going into production? But then, more importantly, every night, because our process of understanding those vulnerabilities, we're taking cryptographic hashes. Every night we recheck. And again, it goes back to that, milk ages pretty badly. Open source libraries go back. So every night it checks any new vulnerabilities. If there are, you get informed via an email to a user group, a role, Jira ticket, manage it as part of your workflow. And then actually, you've probably got applications that aren't in production. So scan those, understand what risk that you have in the organization. And this is all backed up by our security research. And this is where the precision is really, really important. So we have a team of 65 security researchers analyzing disclosures, not just the National Vulnerability Database, OSS Index, VulnDB, hundreds of project sites, bug trackers, every commit every day on the public Git repos, because we want to be very precise and provide information for your developers to fix and remediate. So there's about 4 million vulnerabilities there. About 3 million of them come from the National Vulnerability Database. The rest of it is through our own data research. So thank you for listening. We're in the main hall. We have 50 of these. If anyone wants a nice warm beaker that keeps you, it's going to get cold soon, isn't it? So please come and get one of these. But, you know, I'm a salesperson, so I'm going to say this is the best thing since sliced bread. We have an event in Manchester at the Principal next Tuesday when we've got some practitioners. So we've got Paul from Clydesdale Bank talking about open source and how they've mitigated the risk with our tools and technologies. We've got Dermot from their Co-op Bank, so talking about their digital transformation project, and also Aubrey from Nationwide Building Society, the digital arm, talking about their approach and what they're doing. Please come and listen. It's in the afternoon on Tuesday. Come and listen to some practitioners and ask as many questions as you want. So I'll pause for breath there, and we've got 6 minutes left. So are there any questions? Have I worried everyone? Sorry. Stunned silence. You get 11 minutes. Thank you, everybody.